Misty, go ahead and take roll call.
Mr. Picard?
Mark.
My web page reloaded because of an error, but I'm here.
All right, Mark's here. We can hear you.
Mr. Temperley?
Here.
Mr. Fields?
Here.
Mr. Polachek?
Here.
Mr. Reich? And Mr. Replinger previously informed staff that he would be unavailable for the meeting this evening.
So did Mr. Reich. His email came in quite a while ago, but
I apologize. I must have missed it in my notes.
okay. Up next is the correction and approval of the minutes of June 8th, 2021. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
Motion to approve.
Did you get that, Misty?
No,
Mark made a motion to approve. And
Did you get that?
I'm sorry.
did you get that?
Mark. Mark.
Todd, you're breaking out. I can't hear you at all.
How's this?
Much better.
Okay, yeah, so Mark making a motion to approve.
And who made the second?
And who made the second?
I did. Greg
How's this?
Greg.
Polachek.
Thank you.
And who made it?
I did. Greg.
Okay, so
All
all
in favor, say
aye.
say aye.
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 Any nays?
Any nays?
Nope.
Nope. So we'll go on to item 4, questions and public comment. I think everybody's here for another agenda
All in
item.
favor? Say
So,
aye.
so we'll go right to the director's
Aye.
report.
Nays?
Okay, LSLs, we've got 24 applications in for reimbursement as of now. We know we've got at least a half a dozen more in the construction areas, more also replacements in the construction areas that are going to come in yet this year. And so what we're going to do now is send letters to residents outside of the construction areas so that we can begin replacing LSLs in other parts of the city. And what we're going to concentrate, of course, on are streets that are going to be chip sealed or mill and overlaid or something like that, so we don't have to do damage to new streets. If you recall, we had applied for 75 or funding for 75 replacements. I'm going to guess we're going to fall a little bit short of that, but that's not a bad thing. In this particular program, as I explained, if we don't use all the money, it simply goes back into the kitty and it gets used next year. So that's where we are with that program. The AMI update, and I think I've told you this, we're kind of down, shut down on the water side for now because there's a particular chip that we have to wait for. But on the electric side, we're probably within 1,000 or fewer meters to replace on the electric side. So that's good. And again, it is beginning to pay some dividends. We are not doing as many physical rechecks of meters. We can do a lot of our read-in, readouts for people that are moving now remotely. And we've had a couple of instances already where being able to grab historical data from the meter has helped us to explain high bill usage, that sort of thing. So we're starting to see the benefits. I'm sure we'll continue to see those, and especially as we get the water meters installed, it'll get much better. The next 2 items, and I'll stop. Any questions there? Just stop me if you have them. All right, the next 2 items are kind of related. The EPA required that all water systems with more than 3,300 customers do a risk and resiliency assessment. So we completed that, got that sent in, and now we've got 6 months to put together a plan in response to our R&R plan or our R&R assessment. So we're working on that, and that will walk us through all the things we have to do to be sure that we're ready for natural disasters, accidents, and intentional attempts to get into our system. So that's related to D, because one of the things we're doing right now is really taking a close look at our SCADA systems, getting them up to date, making sure that they are protected so that, again, whether intentionally or by accident, somebody can't get into our SCADA system and start switching around our chemical feeds, shutting off pumps, etc. So it's an item that's really quick to talk about, but there's a lot going on with that. And we'll be looking at some pretty significant upgrades to our SCADA system, the computer system, and we will more than likely have to be adding some kind of visual monitoring system, cameras or something to, first of all, our water systems, and then ultimately electric and probably wastewater also. So as you know, I mean, that's a big deal. Ransomware, all this stuff. People with little more to do than attempt to hack into things, that's coming down the line. The next one is something that I think we've also talked about in the past, and that's Hammerhead. Go ahead, I'm sorry. Sure. You bet. Any other questions on that one, by the way? Okay.
Paul,
Go ahead.
report. Thank you.
I missed that. Oh my gosh. Okay. I thought we'd been hacked. I thought we were too late. Because you know how they want to get to us. Okay, the next thing then is Hammerhead, and I think we've talked about Hammerhead in the past a little bit. Hammerhead is a company in Lake Mills here that does trenchless installation of underground facilities, so boring and that sort of thing. And we've been talking with them for some time, and at Dwayne's persistence, we actually finally got a project together with them where we lined some sanitary sewer. So we were able to go in, and it's the sewer in front of the post office. You notice that was blocked off for quite a while. So we were able to, using their technology, go in and replace that by putting a liner inside of the pipe. And we don't have all the costs put together, but you know, our quick first look is it's considerably less costly than digging up the entire street or digging up all the pipe. It's not, you know, the do-all end-all to repairing pipe, but it sure is a good option in the situations where it'll work. We are planning now to do some storm sewer lining in some areas, and we're talking with them on ways to do some water line lining or repair without having to dig it all up. They have been absolutely fantastic to work with, and they've really rolled out the red carpet to us and teaching us about their technology and their ideas. They've made it very clear to us that we're going to be able to get, you know, whatever supplies we need from them at a good cost. We did purchase one piece of equipment so that we can begin to go in and do our own lining of sewer lines and that sort of thing. So it's a relationship that has taken a while to really get going, but now it's really starting to take off. So we're really pleased with that. My understanding is that they may be using some of our issues for training videos or on-site training, that sort of thing. And that, again, it's just a good situation. We'll keep you up to date and maybe show you some of the videos that come out eventually. So F, I'm going to turn over to Brandon and Dwayne, and they can talk a little bit what's going on with West Lake Street and Reed and Jefferson.
All right, can everybody hear me? Okay, so the let's say 4 main projects we have going on right now are the Jefferson Lake and Reed Street project. That's one contract. The Tyrena Point subdivision, Brookstone subdivision, and then the Sandy Beach boat launch. The Jefferson Lake and Reed Street project, I'll start with Lake Street. That's the biggest portion there. If you've driven by recently, the road is getting put back together. It's up at base course or kind of gravel stage on the road. All the underground utilities are done. They are forming sidewalk today and pouring that later this week for basically the entire remainder of the project. They'll be pouring curb next week, and then the week of the 26th is when they're planning on putting asphalt on Lake Street. One thing on Lake Street that's been a little bit of a hot topic is the first block from Church to Main, the north curb line is going to be removed and raised to kind of make the slope on the sidewalk a little bit less than it would be right now. We're also going to be taking a little bit of a kink out, and there's a low spot from the previous Main Street project that we'll be addressing as well there. So that'll be next week when they pour the curb, when they plan on doing that work. We will be leaving the asphalt that's in that block in place and just wedging a little bit of asphalt in to make the cross slope on the road just a little bit steeper to accommodate that new curb grade. On Jefferson Street, they are at the same road build stage. The curb is in, the sidewalk is in, most of the restoration is actually done. They have a few more stormwater and restoration type work to do, and they will be paving that street the week of the 26th as well. In fact, Payne and Dolan is planning on spending basically that whole week of the 26th in Lake Mills paving various areas. Reed Street is essentially done. That has been paved, it's been restored, the grass is growing in pretty well already. So that's the three main areas of that project. I guess I'll pause to see if there's any questions on that. All right. Go ahead.
Not a question, just a comment. I live right in the middle of that project, and those guys have really been doing a wonderful job.
Okay.
In fact, they've been working diligent. They're out there at 6 in the morning. Sometimes they haven't left until 8 at night.
Yeah, they
really
definitely
have been working
Yeah,
hard.
thanks for that. That's actually a great point. It's probably worth pointing out that the contractual deadline for that project is October 15th. So first time never did a contractor finish 2 months ahead of time. So that's kind of what we're looking at. We are looking at one thing that has come about in the last maybe 3 business days, that We Energies has decided to replace gas main on Lake Street. The timing is not great. We told them that by the time you guys get here, the road is essentially going to be back together. So you're not going to have any advantage of, using our active construction. And their response was, we don't really care. We need to replace it from a life cycle perspective for their own facilities. And they're going to design their replacement for minimal impact. They totally understand that they're going to have to restore some areas. Now, the grass won't be growing yet by the time they get here, but they'll have to restore some areas, likely replace some sidewalk squares here and there, which is unfortunate, the timing of it. But like we were just saying, that if A1 hadn't put so many crews and worked such long hours, the road may have been torn up into the fall anyways. I feel like we're somewhat fortunate that it's going to be essentially put back together by the first week of August, and then have We Energies with some fairly minimal impact after that, going maybe for a month or so. So that's another thing to note on that project. On the Brookstone subdivision, that curb has been installed. The sidewalk is going in soon. It's basically been prepped, and they are again planning on paving that project the week of the 26th. Tyranina Point is, the binder course asphalt is down, all the restoration is complete, and they are paving that final course asphalt the week of the 26th as well. And then the Sandy Beach boat launch is in substantial completion. It's been, people have been using it since Memorial Day. There's just a few minor punch list type items left that they have to complete. So that's, I guess, a good summary. Does anybody have any questions on the other 3 that I just covered real quick there? Dwayne?
Thanks, Brandon. So we'll move on to some of the maintenance projects. Those are just getting underway. Some of the curb and gutter and sidewalk maintenance repairs are starting this week throughout the city. You'll see activity on College Street and O'Neill Street, as well as a number of other streets. Those are in preparation of the chip seal program that the county will do, tentatively scheduled for August. And then later in the fall, working with Payne and Dolan, we'll be looking at mill and overlay and further patching, probably in September and October. So that's the status as of today. Any questions? Thank you. Thank you.
All right, up next, agenda item number 6, discussion on Lake Mills wastewater treatment plant facilities review. And I think we have guest consultants in, so I'll let Steve take it away. Or Paul will? All right.
How's this? A little better? Okay, I'm so sorry about that. As I was saying, we have a couple of representatives from Strand with us today, Scott Stearns and Jane Carlson. Sorry, a little shook up here, and they have been working quite a bit with us on not only the new facilities plan that we're going to be talking about tonight, but a lot of what has happened in the past. Also with us, of course, is Bill Kiesling, who's our wastewater operator and foreman. And so what's going to happen tonight is we're going to give you an overview of where we're going. We'll talk a little bit about where we've been, but a lot about where we've got to go with the treatment plant in light of a number of things that are happening. And as you look through the PowerPoint presentation that Scott and Jane are going to present, you're going to see that there's a timeline in there. And you're going to see that twice because it's a very important timeline. And so basically tonight is an introduction, if you will, of what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of months for sure. So ask all the questions you want. Go ahead, feel free to step in whenever you need to ask a question. But understand there's some heavy-duty decisions coming down the road here real soon. And so with that, I'll turn this over to Scott and Jane, and we'll let this thing go.
All right. Well, like Paul said, we're excited to be here tonight. We are. There are some important decisions that need to be, investigated. I think we've got a good presentation here. Jane is one of our most senior wastewater engineers that we have at Strand, even though she doesn't look it. Just a fantastic engineer. And I'm here to answer any questions that might stump her, that might probably stump me too, but we'll do our best to give you our experience as the city looks forward. So with that, Jane, come on.
Thanks, Scott and Paul, and good evening, everyone. I'll pull up the presentation here. Okay, so as you heard, I'm Jane Carlson, and I've been with Strand about 33 years, and Scott only a few years less than that. And I've been working in our wastewater group for quite a while now, and he's the head of our wastewater group in our Madison office. And the outline of our presentation is shown here. Like Paul mentioned, we're going to show the schedule twice because there's some important dates in there. So we'll start with schedule and decisions, and then get into project drivers for wastewater treatment plant improvements. And then we'll go into history, background, and Bill will help with that, and flows and loadings to the treatment plant, as well as regulations. Then a few slides on potential costs for different options at the treatment plant. You're at kind of a crossroads here where you can either keep the treatment plant at the old site or potentially build a new site. So that's what that will be about. And then potential benefits and drawbacks for those two main options, and we'll close with another look at the schedule and next steps. So first of all, the project drivers. There's a lot of important drivers when it comes to the wastewater treatment plant needs and improvements. First of all, there's a phosphorus rule that I'll describe in more detail. There's also lower effluent limits at the treatment plant, especially if you keep it at the old site where it currently sits. There's aging infrastructure. There's future flows and loadings and growth in the city that has to be considered. Liquid sludge storage and application, that's getting more difficult to deal with the residuals from the treatment process as we're seeing more variation in climate and wet years and things like that. And there's a chance that the existing Rock Creek, where the treatment plant discharges to, will be reclassified in the future, which would drive those effluent limits down even lower. And finally, the current site is landlocked. And I'll show you a picture of that as well. This is our first look at the schedule and decisions, and I won't go through this in a lot of detail this first time through, but the main thing is that Strand would be looking for direction from the board about whether you want to investigate a separate site for the wastewater treatment plant, a new site for the wastewater treatment plant, I should say, versus keeping it at the existing site. So that's a decision. Just whether to investigate it or not is a decision that should be made within about a month. And then there's other activities, including some meetings with DNR that'll be coming up, and finishing the facilities plan, which has been started, and finishing that around the year end, holding a public hearing on that, and then additional phosphorus compliance steps potentially. And finally, the permit requires compliance with effluent phosphorus limits no later than October 31, 2025. And this shows a aerial photo of the treatment plant, and I'll get into a little bit of the history here. I think you can see my cursor, right? Yeah. So the original treatment plant, it was always located on this site along Rock Creek for as long as Bill can remember riding his bike down by the site. And the original treatment plant was a trickling filter. It's kind of really old technology, the way it was oriented. And so in 1988, we started the design of the treatment plant that you see here today with 2 oxidation ditches is what these are called. They provide aeration, and they're there to break down the organic matter in the wastewater, and the final clarifiers and some other processes that I'll describe. The treatment plant's expanded a little bit across the creek as well, to the north side there. And so that was constructed around 91, and there's been one upgrade since then just to add chemical phosphorus removal and another sludge storage tank and make a few other miscellaneous, fairly minor improvements. But a couple things to point out is this site was also a landfill in the past. So it was filled with basically municipal waste, and so that is something we've had to deal with during construction over the years. And that was not uncommon. You put your treatment plant at the low spot in town, and that's also where you probably put your landfill materials over the years. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that the site is pretty landlocked. So there's industries to the north and west, and then there's a mobile home park to the south and residential area over here to the east. Sure.
When was originally planned and built, there's plans for 50% expansion of a third oxidation ditch?
Yes, that is correct.
Could you tell us if that was done?
It has not been done yet, and that is kind of our option number 1, or option A. Let me see if I can just go back there. If you were to expand on this treatment plant, there's room for another oxidation ditch here, but just barely. We would have to keep this roadway here so that equipment can access that middle oxidation ditch. But you could potentially build another ditch here. It would start to kind of infringe on the mobile home park a little bit, and they'd hear a lot more noise and things like that, potentially. And then a third clarifier could go here. So that is one option that's still on the table. Any other questions before I move on? So just a little background on how the wastewater treatment plant works, what the unit processes are. So sewage is collected from all areas of the city and comes into this first location here, the influent pumping and screening building. So that's where the wastewater is pumped up to a higher level so that it can flow by gravity through the rest of the plant. And that's where screening happens to take out plastic materials and things that you don't want interfering with your equipment downstream. It gets out some of the rags and flushable wipes that really should never be flushed and that type of thing. And that material is hauled to the landfill. Then from there, the screened wastewater goes to the oxidation ditches. And these are a location to provide for kind of a natural breakdown of that organic matter that you might see elsewhere in nature, but it's done at a much higher rate here because we're providing aeration and time and growing microbes in that system and also recirculating them. So after the oxidation ditch, it flows to the 2 final clarifiers where those microbes are settled to the bottom of the clarifier, and the clarified, well, and some of those microbes are recirculated back to the oxidation ditch, whoops, to speed up that process a little. But the clarified effluent, if I can go back there, goes on to the chlorine contact tank, where chlorine's added to disinfect any pathogens and activate them. And then from there to dechlorination to get rid of the chlorine residual and aeration of the effluent. And from there, it's discharged to Rock Creek at about this location here, if you can see my cursor. And there's also some other buildings here that, oops, this is a sensitive touchpad here, sorry. The blower dechlorination building, the blower for post aeration is located there, and the dechlorination equipment is there. And then the return activated sludge pumps, that's what the RAS pumps are, what pumps the settled microorganisms back to the head end of the oxidation ditch to help speed up that treatment process. So this is what is done with the residuals from the treatment process. So I mentioned there's return microorganisms that are sent back to the oxidation ditch, but there's also, they're always growing while they're treating the waste. So you always have to waste some of them. And some of those are wasted on a daily basis to a gravity belt thickener where they're pumped across a belt and basically water just drips down through the belt. And meanwhile, the sludge gets thickened. It's still a liquid though, and it gets pumped to one of 5 sludge storage tanks. So there's 2 of them here, and then there's 3 of them across the creek there. Also shown here are septage receiving stations. So there's individuals, homes outside of the sewer service area that can have their septic system pumped and the waste brought here. Sometimes holding tanks too are pumped and brought here. And then the sludge loading building. So after the sludge is thickened and stored, about twice a year it's hauled to agricultural land, and it's land applied as a fertilizer and a soil conditioner. And just some common abbreviations and terms that you might see through the rest of this presentation. So WWTP stands for Wastewater Treatment Plant. I'm sure you've figured out. Influent is the wastewater coming into the plant. Effluent is the treated water leaving the plant to Rock Creek. And then BOD is biochemical oxygen demand. That's a measure of the organic matter in the wastewater. TSS, total suspended solids, those are the solids in the wastewater. Total Caldol nitrogen includes ammonia and organic nitrogen, both that are in the wastewater. And total phosphorus is abbreviated TP there. Million gallons per day is MGD, and pounds per day is LB per day. And this is the existing and projected design flows and loadings for the treatment plant. And I won't go through all of these numbers, but the first column shows the current design flows and loadings. And that's what the treatment plant is rated to be able to manage right now. So roughly 1 MGD and about 1,500 pounds per day of that biochemical oxygen demand. And what we've done in the draft facility plan so far, well, among other things, is we've made some population projections or some projections of flows and loadings based on population projections that have been done by others. So the state of Wisconsin and others, I think in your comprehensive plan, you have some projections for growth in the city. So we use that as the best information we have available to try to project what will happen in the future. So in 10 years, we're showing that the design average flow may need to be 1.1 MGD, and in 20 years, about 1.2 MGD. Of course, that could change if big industry comes into town, something like that. And also, along with that, the loadings of all these parameters would also increase. And basically, between the age of the facility and this growth, essentially every process at the treatment plant is going to require upgrades or expansion within the next 5 to 10 years.
Please.
Yeah, sure.
I saw on this that the flows increased from in the 20 years about 20%, actually a little bit less, with other numbers increased a little bit more than 50%. So could you go into why that would be a little bit, please?
Yeah, I think that's, well, that's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure, but oftentimes when we're projecting loadings, we use a pretty high pounds per person per day for those BOD, TSS, TKN, and TP numbers, assuming that any new homes that are built would have garbage grinders and would probably dispose of their kitchen waste that way. And this might also include some industrial projections as well. Yeah, Scott or Bill, anything to add to that? I think maybe water conservation might be another thing. We often see that organic and other loadings increase at a higher rate than water does. Any other questions there? Okay. All right, and now Bill is going to go through a few photos to show you condition of some of the facilities.
Sure. I think Jane covered it a little bit, but the other thing is the low flush appliances. I think, you know, you've got your new homes are all very water conserving versus what is existing a lot of times is not. So that can impact the flow versus the loading as well. So what you're looking at in this slide is the basement of our influent pumping and screening building. And what you see there in front of you on that table is a influent sampler. That's where we used to sample the influent wastewater coming in, and that actually used to sit on the floor. And then we got a 100-year flood, and we had a table built, and we raised it off the floor because it was underwater and it didn't work very well that way. So we raised it up, and then we got another 100-year flood, and if you look at where the blue pipe is, the water was up higher than that. And so sometimes we're hydraulically limited, I guess is what I'm telling you, when we get these rain events, by the size of the pumps we currently have, and we just can't keep up. So Jane, help me out here. Is this? Whoop. Did it jump?
Yeah, there's a down arrow if you hover. Oh, yeah.
I'll get there. I'm going the up arrow. Apparently it goes the other way. Oh, I was right. Okay. So this is a look at a healthy oxidation ditch. So what you're seeing is there isn't a lot of foam on that. There's really no problems. It's got a good healthy green color, and usually if you could look at it close, you'd see some stratification, or you'd see some lines where the solids are starting to settle and the flock is being formed, and things look good, and that's what we want. And oops, I'm going the wrong way again. This next slide is during an upset, and what you have is we probably got an industrial load came in and wiped out our desirable microbes, the things we want out there. And if it's got greases or oils or any surfactants in it, those are prone to foaming. And they also help a bacteria maybe that we really don't want, or a type. And they're hydrophobic, and they live in that foam and cause more foaming. And so once this happens, it's real easy for the process to get out of control, and you lose your settling, and you don't settle the microbes in the solids and the clarifiers Jane previously discussed. And so at this point, we've got a pretty good problem going on. Now, why it's in one ditch more than the other, I can't tell you. It's the way the ditches load, and they always seem to do that. But it's the way that it loads into the ditches when it comes in. So this is what happens when that happens to us in the winter, and oftentimes it does, because the grease and things tend to float on top and collect in the winter. And so once it freezes, actually we start wasting more solids into it. So I know a lot of you have heard me talk about this when I talk about upsets, is we actually lose control of the process, and as these microbes continue on the surface, we start to, and they freeze, we start to actually waste solids more or less into this mass, and we lose all of our settling, and we don't meet our limits. So when we talk about an upset, these are some of the things we talk about. And we oftentimes have broke this up when it's frozen with a crane. We get a local crane contractor with a heavy weight to drop it on it and try to break it up. And we've used a boat in the past, as you can see here. It was pretty miserable. It was 5 or 10 below that day and windy, and the guys were out there breaking that up. If we don't get it off, again, we won't get control of the process. And if a big chunk breaks off and goes around, it could damage the aerating equipment and damage the plant. So what you're looking at here is a mixer that we occasionally place into the tank when we need to get better mixing in the tank. And this was in there for, I don't know, a couple months, I would guess. And what you see on it is it's absolutely covered with rags. And so these are those flushable wipes and things that aren't supposed to get through that get through, and what they do at wastewater plants. This is a look inside the clarifier, and this is where all the settling takes place. And if you see the little sawtooth looking V-notch weirs, that's where the clear water would go out. And it's hard to see by this picture, but what you have is you have some of that foam and garbage on top of the water, and the water's not a nice crystal clear like it should be. It's got a kind of a brownish green tint to it. And so those solids are inevitably making their way out, not settling like we want them to. And so this is an upset picture. And I guess if there's no questions on that, I'll give it back to Jane.
All right, so for all those reasons, facility planning was begun last year, and facilities planning is meant to provide a roadmap for what the city can do to improve the wastewater treatment plant and address the age of the equipment, tanks and processes. They're all beyond their desirable design life. We usually design equipment to last about 20 years, so we're almost 30 years for much of the equipment. Also, the population projections, industrial growth, increases in flows and loadings from population and industry, and those new effluent limits. And the facilities plan looks at treatment options and includes preliminary costs and preliminary recommendations. So some of that has been done to date. And when we started facilities planning, these are the current effluent limits for the treatment plant that are in the permit. And there's ranges here shown, like for biochemical oxygen demand in the effluent. It's allowed to be from 10 to 14 milligrams per liter, and that range is because the limits are seasonal. So in the summer, they have to be on the lower end of the range, and in the winter, they can be a little higher. Ammonia nitrogen down around 1.6 milligram per liter monthly average in the summer, and phosphorus 1 milligram per liter right now. The permit also includes the 1 milligram per liter is an interim limit, and the permit includes final limits of 0.1 milligram per liter as a 6-month average and 0.3 as a monthly average for phosphorus. So those are very stringent limits. And that's what we started the facility planning on, that basis of those current permit limits. The phosphorus rule we mentioned as a driver for improvements at the plant, and that's the reason those future limits look so low. This was enacted in 2010, adopted by the state, and it's meant to address excess phosphorus because that can cause an increase in aquatic plant and algae growth. As you can see from the photos here, that's what you would see maybe downstream of a creek, like, well, typically in impoundments and lakes, this is where you would see these kind of problems. So this can reduce recreational use of the waters. It can reduce property values and threaten public health, even in the case of blue-green algae, like is shown in that lower right-hand corner. So that's why the phosphorus rules were developed. And there's several compliance options that are available to wastewater treatment plants. Those include, the obvious one would be facility upgrade to implement a tertiary treatment technology. Right now, the treatment plant is considered a secondary treatment plant, with the biological treatment being a secondary process. Tertiary would be if you added an effluent filtration process or another process on the end to really polish that effluent and get the parameters to be much lower in the effluent. So that's one option. Water quality trading is also available, where a treatment plant might trade with a farmer, essentially pay a farmer or a third party to reduce their phosphorus load, and the idea being that it would lower the cost of compliance. Hard to do here, where you've got really Rock Lake is upstream and little tributary to Rock Lake, and Rock Lake has a long detention time, so it's hard to find a trading partner upstream of the treatment plant here. Adaptive management is another option. It's somewhat similar to trading, but it looks at meeting the phosphorus criteria in the receiving stream, so meeting 0.075 milligram per liter phosphorus in Rock Creek. And then finally, the multi-discharger variance. This was a legislative option that was developed, I think about 5 years after the phosphorus rules went into effect, where the facility pays the county on a per pound of phosphorus basis, and the county implements improvements in the watershed that lower the amount of phosphorus. So it's similar to adaptive management or trading. It's just that you let the county take care of the reductions in the watershed. And this is the one that was tentatively selected in the facilities plan. And in fact, we've actually applied for this option for the city with your permit application last April, because it's the lowest cost option. The multi-discharger variance is required because of those really strict phosphorus limits. And this shows approximate dates of phosphorus compliance if you didn't pursue the multi-discharger variance. With tertiary treatment would need to be online by 2025. So if you do the multi-discharger variance, it either delays or avoids those extra actions of building tertiary treatment at the plant, essentially. And did you want to add anything there, Bill? Or okay.
What's the cost of tertiary phosphorus treatment to get to those limits on the current plan?
The cost is coming up on a slide here. Yeah, can I defer to
all improvements, not just the phosphorus improvements on the upcoming slide?
It does, yeah. It covers all the improvements. So I would say just for the tertiary treatment alone, I think it's on the order of $5 million capital. It's pretty costly, yeah.
Pretty big.
Whereas the multi-discharger variance is about a $50 a pound, roughly. And that's paid on an annual basis, so you don't have that big capital cost. But the one thing to keep in mind too, though, is that the MDV might just delay the inevitable. You know, eventually after the multi-discharger variance runs out in 10 or 15 or 20 years, tertiary treatment may need to be built. So the permit application was submitted in April with the multi-discharger variance request in it, and that a siren we have to worry about, or? Okay. Okay. And the DNR has started to review that and submitted a request for more information. So we'll be talking with them about that. Basically, the city, in order to qualify for the multi-discharger variance, we have to show that the cost of the improvements to the treatment plant will be such that residential rates will increase to 1% of the median household income or more. So there's a 1% of the median household income, or MHI, threshold that needs to be met. And currently rates are quite a bit lower than that. They're, I think, are down around 0.6% of the MHI, I would say. So just to give you an idea, that's a threshold that needs to be met, and we're going to be talking with DNR about that more. And wanted to spend a little time talking about effluent limits. We sent a request to the DNR at the beginning of the facility planning process. We always ask them what they think the limits are going to be in the future, and either confirming what's in the current permit or letting us know if they're going to change. And it took them a long time to send us the limits for the plant, and when they did, they were quite a bit lower than the current limits, and indicating that significant upgrades would be required beyond what was already planned, not just for well, I'll just leave it at that. You'll see on this slide. So for more than phosphorus, BOD was, the limits would be cut in half about for the summertime. So 5.5 milligrams per liter instead of 10 in the summer. Ammonia a little bit lower as well. And an important one was phosphorus. We originally were planning on a 0.1 milligram per liter limit, and they told us it would be 0.075, which is as low as you can go when you're discharging to a stream. So that really changes, that doesn't seem like a big difference, but it is in terms of the technology needed to meet that limit. So it would drive up the costs. So Strand looked into, with the city, looked into how the treatment plant effluent limits could be less stringent. So we requested that the DNR recalculate the limits for Rock Creek for the existing treatment plant. And they were using the wrong stream classification, as it turned out. So we requested that they use the current stream classification and also look at what would happen if Lake Mills decided to discharge to the Crawfish River. Normally, a larger river would have more dilution available, and you'd expect to have a little bit higher effluent limits. So for the Crawfish River, we were looking at either keeping the treatment plant where it is and pumping effluent to the Crawfish, or having a new treatment plant near the Crawfish River. And this is a map of what we sent DNR. So the current treatment plant and outfall are shown here at the blue dot. So for option 2, it would be to pump the effluent to a location somewhere along the Crawfish. We just assumed initially that you'd follow County B. Or for the third option of a new treatment plant, we assumed it would probably be north of I-94, but just somewhere within this area. And and the limits would be the same, whether, you know, as long as it was downstream of the confluence with Rock Creek, the limits would be the same no matter where it's located. So they did send us those limits, and those are shown in this table here. For the existing treatment plant, recalculated limits for Rock Creek, turned out those were pretty much the same as what you currently have in the permit. Maybe even exactly the same, except for the phosphorus, still stayed at that 0.075. Then for the discharge to the Crawfish, if the current plant is used for treatment, you can't backslide from that existing treatment capability if it's the existing plant. So the limits would be roughly the same for all, except they did say that phosphorus would increase to 1 milligram per liter. So that was somewhat surprising. And then for a brand new treatment plant discharging to the Crawfish River, it's kind of like you're starting over with a clean slate, so the limits would be higher. The one exception is suspended solids. And that's what some of these footnotes are about. So for total suspended solids, I'm sure many of you heard about the Rock River TMDL, or total maximum daily load, that was done by EPA and the DNR a few years back. And they did that TMDL for both phosphorus and total suspended solids. So they've capped the total suspended solids that the city can discharge. So as flows increase, the concentration of total suspended solids will have to decrease over time. And that's what's shown here for weekly and monthly, calculated at that new design average flow of 1.2 mgd. Those total suspended solids concentrations get fairly low, about 8 milligrams per liter during the worst case month. Any questions on that? Okay. So looking at these three options, we were thinking about non-monetary benefits. Some of these have cost associated with them, but kind of just the pros and cons of these three different alternatives. So first of all, the benefits. If the existing treatment plant is left where it is with the discharge to Rock Creek, the benefit of pursuing that option is that there's already significant investment in the tanks and some of the longer term facilities, longer life facilities at the treatment plant, and all the wastewater already comes there, so there's less pumping required. And there's familiarity from operations staff. Then if the existing treatment plant is left, but the discharge is pumped to the Crawfish River, similar benefits, but you could also potentially keep that higher phosphorus limit that they mentioned. And another thing about the crawfish is you might have lower ammonia limits in the future, but they wouldn't be as stringent as if you were discharging to Rock Creek. And then finally, for the new treatment plant discharging to the Crawfish River, there's a lot of benefits to that. It would have the highest effluent limits, as you saw. You'd be better able to address future growth and future effluent limits because there's more room for those effluent limits to get more stringent over time. You're starting at a much higher level, so you wouldn't expect anything too stringent in the near term for sure. And there's more opportunity for buffer between the treatment plant and residences and industries compared to what you have now. All treatment facilities would be on one site, including biosolids management, and that's something that I'll mention on the next slide as a disadvantage to the existing site. It's also possibly the lowest present worth cost option, but only if you look at it on a longer term basis. So the capital cost and operating costs over a long term, like 30 to 40 years, it might end up being the better alternative. But that would not be the case on a 20-year present worth basis, likely. It's also more easy to serve growth to the north and northeast. There's also the potential to improve Rock Creek and the surrounding area if the treatment plant is decommissioned. And you could have the potential to look at different treatment technologies or to regionalize if that was beneficial. And then as far as drawbacks go, for the existing treatment plant discharging to Rock Creek, there's still the potential that land application or land acquisition would be required, either for that third oxidation ditch if it doesn't fit quite on the site, or at least for biosolids management, which is the next line item there. Also, the very stringent phosphorus limits and other limits are likely to decrease in the future. I mentioned that stream classification, and the DNR had miscalculated the limits using the wrong stream classification, but they do want to eventually reclassify Rock Creek. It's a goal of theirs. So we don't know if it'll be in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but eventually they'll likely reclassify it to a higher quality stream, which will reduce the effluent limits for BOD, TSS, and ammonia. Also, the MDV eligibility is somewhat questionable. I mentioned that the DNR is asking us for more information about that, so that's a potential drawback. The existing site was an old landfill, which adds a little bit of complication to the construction, and it's definitely significantly more difficult to expand in the future on that existing site. So we've shown that you can add a ditch likely and a clarifier for the 20-year plan, but we're talking about beyond that, it would be very difficult. If you went with the existing plant but discharged to the Crawfish River, it would have similar drawbacks to that existing site. And this is running off the page here, but you'd also need easements for that effluent force main, and you'd have to pump the effluent, so that would add power costs. And then new treatment plant discharging the Crawfish River. Again, this is likely the highest cost option, even if we looked at 20 years of O&M costs and what that means. And land acquisition would be needed for the new treatment plant, including provisions for future expansion and setbacks to residences and so on. And it might be challenging to site it. The floodplain would be one thing we'd want to avoid. Also setbacks to homes, and the NIMBY, not in my backyard factor, could also come into play there. The multi-discharger variants would not be available with that option, and if you went with that option, you'd still have to have a pumping station at the existing treatment plant site to pump everything to the new plant, everything that comes here now. But then for new development, hopefully that could flow by gravity or be pumped a shorter distance to the new treatment plant. So these are the preliminary capital costs for the three options, and we're showing a range there because it depends on whether that effluent tertiary treatment or filtration is needed. So these are April 2021 dollar basis, about 20 million max for expanding at the existing treatment plant for the next, that'll get you covered for the next 20 years, or about 24 million if we have to build a force main to the Crawfish River, and about 30 to 35 million if there's a new treatment plant near the Crawfish River. But these costs don't include land acquisition or special measures like dealing with the landfill materials or rock, things like that. And environmental site assessments would be recommended for any new sites. And for now, we assumed that the same technologies that are at the current treatment plant would be used at the new treatment plant, just for simplicity.
Question about that. But my general observation just driving around Wisconsin is a lot of places cannot use oxidation ditches. So if you did build a new plant, it probably wouldn't be an oxidation ditch plant, would it?
Well, I think that would be our first choice because of the size of the plant. So if it's a smaller plant, sometimes much smaller plant, you sometimes go with a different technology, like a package plant or a recirculating sand filter. And then if it's a bigger plant, you might go with like primary clarifiers and conventional activated sludge in rectangular tanks and things like that, and maybe even anaerobic digestion. But for this size facility, we would typically go with an oxidation ditch as a first choice.
At a new site.
Even at a new site, yeah. But I do have a slide coming up on that where we could certainly look into different options. That would be another advantage of a new site, is you can take a step back and see if there's a better technology. If we went with conventional aeration tanks, though, you would have to have separate aerobic digestion for the waste sludge. So that's another unit process and probably some blowers that would be required. But another thing you could do is maybe consider biological phosphorus and nitrogen removal all at the new plant. There's not enough space for that really on the existing site, but we could look at that for a new site. And you could look at different ways to manage the sludge. Maybe dewater it initially to get more of the liquid out, because it makes it easier to store and cheaper to haul. You do have to kind of sling it onto the agricultural fields though when you dewater it, and then disc it in, have the farmer disc it in right away. But that is an option. And if you dewater, then you're set up better for future drying of the sludge, which removes almost all of the water. And if you were to dry it, then it's really easy to give it away even for fertilizer. So those could all be looked at. Yeah, and then I mentioned already the storage. So if it's dewatered, it's easier to store in just like a pole barn type of a thing with open sides rather than in liquid tanks. And if you dewatered or dried it, you could have the option of landfilling it instead of land applying it too. So that gives more flexibility.
Is land applying going to be feasible down the road or allowable?
Another good question. Yeah, it's hard to project. We think that your sludge is very high quality here, and it has a really good fertilizer value, and it adds organic material to the soil, which is all good. So hopefully it would continue to be accepted. But that is a reason why some people are moving more toward drying so that they get an even better quality product, easier to distribute.
Would you just go with screw presses, or would you put in an actual drying operation other than screw presses to squeeze the water out?
Yeah, you do something like a screw press just to dewater it. So that would be the first step. And then if you were to go to the next step of drying it, you'd go with a dryer that has a heating system in it to evaporate the water.
Okay.
We've typically had some problems being able to consistently get land application done. And so we've had problems with having enough storage as it is. So if we end up with if we're going to continue with this type of storage, we're going to have a lot more tanks on the site.
Yeah,
So-
or off-site, we were thinking, potentially at a remote site. Mm-hmm.
So if you went with the drying or screw presses, you'd considerably lower your water rate. So if you had to throw some in a landfill, the expenses would be a lot lower. That would be a big cost savings for operations.
If you
The
were to
other one is-
landfill it,
Yeah.
there's tipping fees though associated with that too. Like it's not typically accepted as a cover material, so landfills do typically charge, and I'm not sure how the charges would be around here. Have you ever looked into that, Bill? Yeah. So I think when at treatment plants that do dewater their sludge, they usually find that it's a little bit less expensive to land apply it than to landfill it, unless they have a really good arrangement with the landfill.
In the long run, when you look at this existing site, you get the oxidation ditch, the additional clarifiers, and the potential tertiary treatment along with the sludge storage. You're going to be really cramped. We're probably going to have to buy additional land on the site. So or in the area. So it's not as easy as saying, well, we're just going to add an oxidation ditch.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And that is one reason we were suggesting that with any of the options, including staying at the existing site, you'd probably need more land for, at least for sludge management off-site. As far as the impact on rates, it's really too soon to project those. And it'll depend on different things like looking at the final technologies and the operation and maintenance costs, as well as the capital costs, and whether low interest loans and principal forgiveness are available, which low interest loans are very easy to get, but principal forgiveness may be also a possibility, which would be like a grant for a portion of the project costs. Possible regionalization, if you wanted to look into that with neighboring communities. Grants can sometimes be found, or incentives for high efficiency equipment, and phased or stepped construction, which we do recommend that you implement these improvements in phases if it makes sense financially. So that would all have to be looked at before we could give you an idea of the impact on rates. But rates would definitely have to go up with any of these alternatives. So we're back to our schedule and next step slide here with what main thing we're looking for is if the city's interested in looking in more detail at a brand new wastewater treatment plant site closer to the Crawfish River. And if so, then we would continue, first of all, with our meeting with the DNR to get more answers about the multi-discharger variants and availability of that, as well as effluent limits. But if you did want to explore that new treatment plant site in more detail, then we would recommend that the city begin to review land requirements and availability. And then some other dates are shown here. The permit will be reissued. It's on schedule to be reissued September 2021. Sometimes DNR is a little later than that, but if they're late, your old permit will just continue in place till it's reissued. And then completing the draft facilities plan. Right now, we've asked the DNR for an extension to October 31, 2021, so we can look into this if you'd like. And then we'd have to have time for addressing any DNR comments on that plan, as well as city comments and so on. And then holding a public hearing likely in the beginning of next year. And these last two items are only if you were to build tertiary treatment for phosphorus. So I think that was my last slide. Yep. Any other questions or anything you want me to go back to?
I'd like to make a comment about that. There's design life and then there's actual life.
Yeah.
Those are two different things, correct?
Yeah, they certainly are. Yeah, is that your question, Paul? Or?
Yes, basically, if, the previous plant, if we replace the current plant now, then the current plant would have lasted 20 years. But if it pays more, if it's more cost effective, if the present value is more than 20 years out, it's not a very good investment, right?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a good investment for an industry for sure.
If it's going to be replaced 20 years from now.
Yeah.
So there's a disconnect there.
Okay.
So I think what you see at a wastewater treatment plant is that you've got two different components. One is you have all the concrete, and so that the concrete tankage and all that structure, that doesn't have a 20-year life. That has a 40-year life, 50 years. I mean, there's tanks that we're using in various treatment plants that are 50, 60 years old.
So what's the definition of design life?
So it's the equipment, the equipment that gets put into the aerators that are spinning, the gearboxes, the motors, the pump impellers, those sorts of things that are, they have a finite number of spins in them before, before the bearings, even really well maintained equipment. At some point in time, it's like driving a car that's got 200,000 miles on it. I do all the maintenance, but at some point in time, you're going to run into something maintenance wise that just doesn't make sense to and I probably everybody on the board drives their car to 500,000 miles. So maybe my point is moot. But I think that there is a finite life to wear items, I guess, for lack of a better term. So getting to your question, Paul, about can we extend the life, extend the payback period, get a 30-year loan instead of a 20-year loan. Those are, I don't think DNR is doing that currently. I don't think they are. Normally what has happened, what I've seen anyway, is that those sort of kind of longer payback periods are reserved for communities that have very low median household incomes. So it's kind of one of those things that is used to try to lessen the blow for ratepayers in really poor communities. Now there are programs out there, and so I don't mean to say that there's absolutely no funding sources that don't have longer paybacks, but I would say the main ones, the DNR Clean Water Fund loan, I don't believe has a 30-year option.
That I've heard, no.
Okay, I'm going to recede and let you take that back.
I think though that all the presentation showed that the benefit of the existing building and site was a benefit because it will last somewhat longer. The real debate becomes permit issues because Rock Creek, she already mentioned, Rock Creek is only going to get tougher. We get a lot of expansion down that way. And as the city continues to expand, all the wastewater runs down Rock Creek. So at some point, Rock Creek hits the Crawfish. So the best point for the next wastewater treatment plant is at the Crawfish.
Or the Rock River.
Well, that's in Jefferson. It doesn't hit.
Well, it's just, you know, you keep on going all the way.
Right, but a river is substantially better than a creek. Especially, you already heard that the creek is going to get tightened down. We have to release water all the time to maintain any flow. And if you're investing and you're looking at, you know, you already noted that the plant goes beyond 20 years. She's already noted that the capital investment once you get past 20 years is better on the crawfish than it is on the rock. You know that our expansion opportunities where we're at are going to be extremely limited, and they're not going to be cheap because we have certain types of relocation projects that we're going to have to do there. So you start to balance those out. They're not as far apart as you think. Yes, initially the one is going to be cheaper, and it's reasonable to take that assumption. There is some time left in this plant, but it's time to start thinking both ways. And, you know, if we continue, it's most likely that we're going to grow north and east, or south and east. And because of those two options, the wastewater treatment plant heading this direction is very logical. And so you have to kind of weigh and balance those, because the first thing that we look at is okay, as we continue to move this way, when we looked at how we were going to run the wastewater over to the north side, it ran up Rock Creek and then turned and headed west. Well, if you put the wastewater treatment plant there, everything would have flowed there at that point where you turned and went. So if you continue to head that direction, the logical point is that the best flow option for most of our development is going to be at Rock Creek. At some point in time, you're going to, even if you invested heavily in the one that's at the current location for a long time, you're probably going to have to build a second wastewater treatment plant at the next site. If you prepare for the site in the future now by buying the land as it is, where it's open and available at probably its best price, then you have the option of being able to relocate everything there and consider all your new options. And that's all we wanted to do, was we wanted to consider all our options. So you want to weigh them and balance them, but you want to think about it in the long term and how all the other features of it tie together. And that's all we're asking. We didn't deny that there's more life in the existing plant, and I think we'll end up with tertiary treatment there at some point in time, because that's going to get screwed down on that creek pretty hard. And I don't think it's going to be 10 years out, but those are issues that are, you know, we kind of have to. I don't have a crystal ball, and I know you don't, Mark. And it's like,
here's a question: Is it better to build a new plant now, or is it better to put money into this plant and build a new plant 20 years from now?
And that's the question. It's like I said, 20 years from now.
Let's crank the numbers.
Yeah, and 20 years from now, all the residential development along Rock Creek blocks us, or along Rock Creek and the Crawfish River blocks us from being able to get the wastewater system down there.
But you don't know that.
And I agree, but that's
a hypothetical you just said there.
All I'm going to say is that, you know, I watch Chicago grow out, and I watch Milwaukee grow out, and I watch Waukesha grow out, and it's going to happen. The question is how fast and what do we protect in the process.
Well, think about how far it's grown out in the last 20 years, and it depends how far out you're going. If you're talking about 2 miles away on near Crawfish River, that's not going to happen.
Well, it grows faster and faster as you get bigger and bigger. The next question is you know, if you'd have said that about Pewaukee or Mequon back in the year, they said the same thing. All of a sudden they got all these problems. I'm thinking
then there's a dozen other communities that didn't have problems. So what?
Yeah, well, yeah, you could go up to Florence and say that, yeah, they actually shut down their wastewater treatment plant. They don't need it anymore. I mean, but we're not in that position. We're going to grow.
We're somewhere in between.
we're gonna
Probably.
hit the fast track pretty soon. Whether it's in the city of Lake Mills or in the town of Asplin or the town of Milford, it's going to happen. Because we're just in that zone where it's going to happen now.
Bill, I know you want to say something, but I realize population is one of the drivers that was listed, and it's a good one. I don't think we can lose sight of the regulations that we're going to have to deal with. And what you're saying is exactly what we're looking for from you guys is, give us a little guidance as to what direction we should or should not go. Should we be looking at, the huge big picture of a new plant somewhere, or do you want us to keep it, a little smaller, that sort of thing? That's an internal debate that we can have and maybe come up with some ideas what we'd like to do, but we can't do that without your input and guidance. And so I don't want to lose sight of the fact that this is the type of debate we have to have, but we also have to focus on the knowns and a few hypotheticals, what ifs. And I'm looking at engineers who love to play what if, and so we've got to do some of that, but we also have to keep in mind that this is also being driven by regulations and limits and that sort of thing.
I think though that Mark said one thing. I think Mark said one thing that was important, and let's look at the numbers for both. And I think that's an important issue. Some of it was about if we're just going to look at the one, but if we get to look at the numbers for both, I think that's important.
Well, it's a whole lot less costly to do a little planning up front than to not know and pick the wrong solution. It's 50-50, but boy, I'd sure like to know a little bit more before putting the money down.
That's why we. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly why we've done it this way, and now you're at that point where you guys get to say, yeah, continue or no. So.
Yeah, Mark, Bill Keeling. Yeah, I guess I'll go on the record and say I'm not a big proponent of change. I like my wastewater treatment plant. And so on the surface, I tend to agree with you, but I mean, some of the things that are making me start to think the other way are the fact that the DNR at this point won't really tell us what they're going to reclassify that stream to. So if they do, then I think, well, if we stick, $13 or $15 million into that site, and then later on we're still not able to meet our limits again, then what do we do? And so that's something that you guys need to think about and wrestle with, and we need to think about and wrestle with. And then I think, we're not getting all the real firm, definitive answers that we need right now from the DNR, and that's a little hard. And the other thing is that we've got a timeline going on. We've got our permit, we've got phosphorus compliance, and I mean, we'd be foolish if we weren't doing facility planning at the same time or looking at that at the same time we're trying to comply with the phosphorus rule. So we've got all these three things coming together, and there's a timeline, and I think we're all staff just kind of wants to present you with what all the options are so that you guys can give the guidance to go the way we need to go, because originally, like I said, there's more life in this plant, and there's a way that we can do some things with it, but you hate to invest heavily. There you are now with $20 million invested in this plant, and you got to scratch it and start over. And so that's something to think about. I don't know.
I've got a question. So I think it's somewhere on slide 8, the projected flows were based on the city's comprehensive plan. And there were a couple of comments made. One question I have was the year 2032 and the year 2042, are we growing faster than the comprehensive plan? And one question is, I have another question. One question is, you revise those projected flows based on there's been some really good growth here in the last 2 years. That's one question. The second question would be, comment was made that the capacity there for residential growth, but no business growth. And so, how do you dovetail the business growth into projected growth?
Okay. Yeah, and first of all, with the, I made that comment about the comprehensive plan, but I'd have to go back and look at how we did the projections in the end, because I know we typically look at census data and try to project that out, and then we look at what the Department of Administration thinks it's going to be in 20 years, and we also typically look at the comprehensive plan. So I'm not sure if that exact number came from the comprehensive plan or from the state, but I could get back to you on that. And then as far as industry, what we typically do is check with industries to see if they have any plans for growth. And a lot of times they don't plan that far out. So what we often do is include a factor like 10% extra for unplanned industrial growth. And we tried to use, I think, a higher factor than is typically allowed by the administrative code initially, because you do have industry here and located in a place where it could grow faster than the population grows. But the DNR held us back from that. So I think our original projection was a 1.3 MGD in 20 years, and they held us back a little on that. Kept it at 1.2. Does that answer?
I can tell you that DOA's estimates are always low. So if you look at the historical running and you take and you put it in a graph, every 10 years, we go like this, then we go like this, based on, because all we have is their projections. And then when we actually get the census, we go up like this. So it still is not, out of line. I think it's still in the low twos. So housing development in 2008 took a dive. You could put up a house. We've been putting in those lots. They've been building houses faster than we can get the lots done. So it's a question of, is the housing available? Will the capacity to build more housing come online? And that could change it. If we put in an industrial park, which we've talked about, multiple times, we get on a regular basis questions where Brandon sends back and says, if that industry comes, you're going to have to double the size of your wastewater treatment plant. So those are regular things that we deal with. It's a question of, what can we provide? Once we build it, we have to tell them what we can provide, and that's the end of it. But those are the questions we have to kind of work through. Is do we want to have that capacity or not? Do we, I think some of Bill's statements were the most relevant is that we invest $15-20 million in the existing site, and 5-10 years later we got to dump the whole thing and move on. That's a huge loss. It's a loss even now. But if you invest another $20 million in it and then have to move again, it's really a huge loss. So those are the kinds of things that, I'd like the numbers more. I'd like more numbers too, because looking at that and trying to forecast that and making a mistake is going to cost.
Yeah. I'd just like to add, I think if you were going to move it, you'd want to make sure you got enough land where you could expand it quite a ways into the future. And I mean, it depends on where you found that land, and if you could even find land with a sludge application site on it, then you'd have a lot more flexibility that way. So there's a lot of neat things you could do if you moved it, obviously, but the price tag's pretty big. So, I mean, I think Lake Mills has to decide how big it's going to get and what it wants to be. And if it's going to grow, then you're going to end up having to build a treatment plant now or later. I mean, I've come to that reality myself, I guess. So
I don't know that it's a reasonable question to ask how big we want to be. We're going to be as big as they drive us to be, because look at Thiensville. You can't tell where Thiensville begins and ends because it's totally surrounded by Mequon. And you look at Monona and it's totally surrounded by Madison. And, you know, like Sherwood and those types of cities, they're all totally surrounded. So the question is, you know, are we going to let Johnson Creek come in? Are we going to let the town of Asplin totally develop out on us? Are we, they're going to be there. They're going to be people there. So the question is, are they in the city of Lake Mills or not?
I got two things quick. One is, we're not at a crisis here. You know, we've got some time to plan and do this right. We're at a crossroads where we've got to do something, but we're not in a crisis mode. And as I've been thinking about this, it seems like a treatment plant is one of the tougher things to plan. You know, if we get a big customer, something that wants electric service, that's relatively easy to do. Or water service, it's relatively easy to put in another well or something like that. But to increase the capacity of a treatment plant, not so easy. And so this is a decision that has really significant ramifications, and it's going to be real easy to undersize it or oversize it. And I think, as everyone's been saying, the debate is what is the right middle ground, and that's we're kind of asking for permission to continue looking for that right answer, even though we're not quite sure what it's going to be. That's a tough thing to do.
My advice is to follow the numbers. You know, make estimates. You know, make various estimates, including reclassification of the stream or not, at high side, low side, and see where the numbers come out. It's still going to be a touchy-feely thing because which estimate do you use? Which is the most likely thing to happen? But it gives you a little more firm ground to work from at least.
Agreed, and we wanted to make sure, I'm sorry, we just wanted to make sure you've got some background to help with the guidance, and then when you get those numbers. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
To that point, taking back to picking up what Steve just said about maybe other communities, other communities, we could be surrounded. Is this the time to ask about regional? And it was alluded in the PowerPoint, which, by the way, is very thorough. Thanks for putting this together. But maybe there's a little more information around issues. And what would that look like? What possibilities are there?
Johnson Creek has the Rock River. They're likely going to continue to dump right there. They may move south towards Jefferson just because of the flow and the development that they have. If they jump the Rock River and start moving into the town of Asplin more to the west, then they would have to hit that ridge. Town of Asplin has no sanitary sewer. I don't think that they ever plan on having it. What's happened with them in Jefferson is at that point in time where that sanitary sewer is needed in a neighborhood, they annex to one of the local communities and take the sewer. So like a lot of those developments to the north of Jefferson have annexed. So you'll notice their boundaries are as weird as ours. So it becomes, we talked about regionalization, and probably the only thing that we have is we have the sanitary district. So we don't do just the city of Lake Mills for wastewater. We also do town of Lake Mills or portions of town of Lake Mills. We would prefer not to have that type of agreement in place. We usually use a municipal boundary agreement, which requires that if you get water or sewer, you're going to be in the city. And so where it heads, if we bump into, let's say, Johnson Creek or Jefferson, then yeah, there would be reason to say we'd want to go that way. Particularly Jefferson, seeing as they're to the southwest, which is where our, water drains to. So yeah, that would be the most logical long-term regional opportunity.
Thank you.
Let me try to just recap so we get some guidance here. And I don't know if this is going to require a motion or just consensus, however you want to do it. But so you are saying look at as many options as possible here, make some assumptions and get some estimates together, and do consider the idea of regionalization to whatever extent. I don't know if we're at the point where we would contact communities, but at least have some kind of a plan in that regard. And I had it when I started, but there was a third point I can't think of. Say what? I'm old? Yes, I am old. Getting older every second. Darn it. There was one other thing I was going to say that we would want you to consider, and maybe you're ahead of me on this one, but go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I was thinking for regionalization, we could maybe start by looking at population estimates and some of the existing published information, or if you wanted to really explore it deeply, sometimes the DNR has funding available for exploring regionalization. So if something looked promising, we could consider that. But yeah, we could evaluate different scenarios. I think one of them that you mentioned, Mark, was the looking at staying at the existing plant for 20 years and then the new plant built out in a different site. So that could be one scenario.
And I'm sorry, I can't believe I didn't remember this. Try to start looking at the impact on rates. What would some of these options do to our rates? We've got to at least start talking about that. We have to be very careful with that. Even now, if somebody watches this, I can hear the phone call tomorrow. You're talking about a $40 million plant, so we have to make sure that we frame this properly and give out the right information. But am I kind of summarizing where you guys are coming from?
But yeah, my left side, I was I mean, I think we still want to explore all the options that were presented in the PowerPoint. So, with more information, that's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
So
this is just our first discussion.
Oh, and that was going to be my next question. So we kind of have that direction. We had indicated we would like that at the next meeting. Do you want to wait till then and actually give that direction, or should we let the folks from Strand know? Okay, it's time to start.
There's an August deadline, right? Yeah. Yeah. So I guess we're giving you permission to.
That's the point.
Get more information.
All right, and you've got what you need then?
Yeah.
Jane and Scott? Okay.
So good. Yep.
Is
Thank
there
you.
any possibility with DNR rules regarding trading? I know the watershed here is not large, but there is a watershed upstream.
Yeah. Your question was whether that would be viable. Is that what you're asking? We did look into it as part of the draft facility plan and the preliminary phosphorus compliance alternative plan, which is another document that was.
Yeah, and specifically for phosphorus.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it didn't look favorable. It was hard to even find enough pounds out there in the watershed.
And then, to me, it's all about let's relating the future cost present value for present dollars, so to make a more apples to apples comparison.
Okay. Yep. Will do. Okay.
Oh, okay. All right, so is that clear enough, Paul? Direction for the next meeting?
Yes, and you guys are good with that? So
Yep. Thank you very
now,
much.
I guess the other question then is time frame for them. Do we come back at the next meeting with something? Does that give you enough time, or are we looking?
Would it be maybe in 2 months, I would say? I think it would take a bit to put all this together, including the total present worth costs. Would it
Like,
September?
Take as much time as you need if you want to do it right.
Okay, and that's what I was looking for, so that's
Maybe
great.
we'll get back to you on that, though. If
Okay.
That's okay.
Perfect.
Do our,
Good.
do our math and get back to you. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you. I mean, that helps immensely that everybody's getting a handle on this and we can continue to move forward. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, it was.
Appreciate it.
All right, item 7, discussion on 2022 capital improvement projects. We have a prepared motion, 21-7-1. I would like to have a motion to approve to start the debate.
Motion to approve motion 21-7-1.
Yeah.
Second?
I'll second.
All right.
Motion made by Mark Ricard and seconded by Steve Fields. I presented several documents on the capital budget. It goes out to 2027 for multiple projects. They're pretty consistent through all the departments that we follow the same process that's down each one of the streets. So Oak Street is the primary one on 22, College Street in 23, Mill Street 24, East Prospect Street in 25, and Franklin Scott Street's in 26. And, I think it's Fremont Street in 27 and Lakeshore Drive in 28. So you got a feel for what our estimated costs are for street improvements, sidewalk, storm sewer, water, sewer, and electric. Then it also includes equipment, but the primary thing we're looking at right now, although we can have discussion on the equipment ones, is the street projects. Are there anything that you believe we should change or redo? I know Dwayne provided a spreadsheet that looks at the ratings on the street, and then it had some notes about, things that we considered like stormwater, traffic, primarily LSLs, and those types of things. So, is there any other debate on it or discussion or questions related to any of those?
I didn't see anything that stuck out as a red flag.
This is consistent with what we've kind of had in the process for several years, but obviously things change from year to year. But we still feel really comfortable with Oak Street, particularly that's a high LSL street. Second only to, I think, West Lake Street, and then it kind of heads over to College, and then Fremont. Fremont had a lot of them replaced though recently. People were kind of ambitious, and when the loans grants came through, a lot of people did that. So.
I have a question on vehicle replacement. So the trucks replaced on trucks and other vehicles replaced on schedule or based upon condition?
We have them in on a schedule, but then we evaluate their condition, and then we do make adjustments to the budget. I think even this year, if you look at it, we had trucks in there. We ended up buying wheel loaders, so the wheel loaders are gone. Ended up that the wheel loaders needed to be replaced fast, and so the trucks got shifted down because they were still in relatively decent shape. And so those are kinds of things that we look at, but we do kind of try and keep them on somewhat of a schedule because they tend to become maintenance items if we push them down too far. So it's a weigh and balance thing, but we try and run the heavy equipment as long as we can. So wheel loaders and backhoes stay on. Well, I think with the ones that we've had were here before me, so
And some equipment, intensive equipment naturally lasts and get another year.
Yeah. Yeah, and it depends on your usage, but you know, some of it's changed over the years too. You know, wheel loaders we didn't use as much. Now all of a sudden we use wheel loaders for everything. That snow blower, I know they have it on there. That thing is an antique. It still works, so it's on the schedule to be replaced in a couple of years. But it's something that we use on a relatively minor period. It has taken a lot of maintenance in the last several years, but because we use it so little, it's been something we've been willing to wait for because some of the other equipment is pushing it harder.
And if there's capacity to do the maintenance and it doesn't cause downtime, it's not so bad. But if it causes downtime or excessive maintenance, if you don't have capacity for it, then it becomes an issue, of course. So it's a balancing act.
Yeah, you know, the trucks they tend to be kind of important because if they're broke down, snow plowing doesn't get done, or you know, a lot of the road construction or maintenance during the year doesn't get done. Snow blowers only used in the downtown area and by the schools. And while it does cause some problems downtown if it's down, and generally it's minor enough that we can get around it. So,
Thank you.
and those are the kinds of things we weigh and balance. But we do have a schedule that they're on. We do evaluate that, but we look at it and say, okay, this piece of equipment is at that point in time where, you know, maintenance may become a real item.
In the equipment budget here, are we taking into account for some growth of the city too with, you know, additional plowing as we keep adding streets and subdivisions, stuff like that also?
Well, he does have one in there at the far end of it for an additional new snowplow. That debate becomes, how do you man that truck? Because, you know, we set up our trucks based on how many people we have, and our routes are set up on how many people we have, and it becomes harder and harder as we get more and more streets to get the people who we have. So, you know, if you're asking why they're running so fast, well, they're a combination of reasons. First of all, some those trucks are now all automatics, and you need to keep a certain amount of speed on them, but it's also because they have a certain amount of roadways they need to get done in a certain period of time. So, yeah, you've heard the debate, you were at the meeting, so it's a situation of equipment versus personnel. Normally what we like to do is we like to buy equipment rather than add personnel, because personnel have a different type of cost in the long run. But if you don't, each piece of equipment eventually needs a certain amount of personnel to manage it. So we try and look at that. So you know, wheel loaders with the double wings on them, or trucks with the double wings on them, save us time because we can do 2 lanes at a time rather than 1. You know, salting operations. If you were pre-wetting, is better than just spreading salt, and actually using the liquid salt is better than both of them in the long run for being able to be effective in doing it. But it's eventually at some point in time, you just got to have someone to drive the truck.
Yeah, I was going to kind of try to mention it. When we look at a vehicle, we don't look at just replacing same for same. If we can get dual purpose vehicles or whatever, so that we're trying to keep up with the times. I mean, you see a bucket truck in here, that may not be a full scale big bucket truck. It might be something that'll fit in a smaller area. So we really evaluate that stuff. It's not just one for one, just to do it.
Any motions to add or remove? Do you have anything to add, Dwayne, or?
Because I wasn't connected to 8x8, I came here for questions in case there were any. some of the details you've been provided. There are obviously some other additional background information that we have if you have further questions. But thank you.
And as always, the key is this year or 22, because it's likely to change again at some point in time.
Right.
We run basically 5 or 6 year budgets on everything. So because we want to be able to project out far enough that we can say, well, this expense this year is going to crush us in the future years. And so it just gives us a good opportunity to evaluate.
And it gives people a heads up. Their street is coming up in 5 years. Like mine. If they know. If they know, yeah.
Well, if you remember, we had Lake Street on for 19, and because Main Street and Mulberry ended up in that year, we pushed that street back 2 years. And if you can remember, just about every other meeting, Mrs. Fritsch mentioned that, yes, we were going to do Lake Street because all our constituents were calling her about when was Lake Street going to get done. Now it's getting done. It's been done extremely fast. And you still get complaints about how it's done. So,
if I may, I will make one point. The one chart that we did give you a list of all the streets, those are the streets that are rated 4 or less. So the worst streets surface ratings, and at least even beyond what we're looking at projections of moving even to 2030 in that chart. Not saying that those are locked in those years, but it gives you an idea of where there are a number of streets, not even in this plan out to 27, that are still probably in pretty poor shape that we will have to address, possibly before that time. But it does give you a little idea of how many streets are still on that list as we even take one a year in this program. So hope
what
that
he
helps.
means by addresses is we may not do a full rebuild on it. We may come back and do some larger maintenance project on it. And the problem with that for me is, let's take Prospect Street. It's in really bad shape. It has no stormwater for miles. And so if you put brand new pavement on that, as flat as that street is, the stormwater is going to start penetrating that pavement, and it's not going to, it'll be like Mulberry. It's always going to be in bad shape. Even when you put new surface on it. So it's kind of that way in balance. Which streets? We did Grove. We did a mill in Overland Grove, but you notice, I think we've had 4 or 5 water main breaks on Grove since we've done that. And we had to do Grove because that was the alternate route for South Main Street. We didn't really have any choice, but I don't know about you, but it just kills me to drive down that street and see, all those water main breaks in it. And so those are the kinds of debates that you kind of have. And I know we're going to have to do something, and we're going to have to pick some of those 4 streets that we're going to have to do some type of maintenance on that may not last as long as it should. But we got behind the 8 ball, and now we're on that new schedule with maintenance and stuff, and we're starting to catch up. But there are just some areas where we have to evaluate different than we would just normally under the maintenance program.
Any other questions? Pete? All right, Misty, we have a motion, so can you take the roll call, please? Do you hear me?
Mr. Temperley?
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Fields?
Aye.
Mr. Polachek?
Aye.
Aye.
Mr. Pickard?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion passed 4-0.
All right, recommendations for future agendas. I don't have any. Does anybody on the board have any? Staff, other than what was discussed previously? Any recommendations?
Well, just a reminder, thanks. Obviously, Strand will be back with the treatment plant. September is what they're looking at, and September is also when we'll do our deep dive into the water utility. And then November will be when we come back with a deep dive continued into the electric utility.
All right.
And Steve, do you want street maintenance?
I guess I'll adjourn the meeting then.
Wait a minute.